All right, anatomy fans, this is our last chapter covering the nervous system. There was a comment that sometimes my face would get in the way of the figures, and so I figured maybe if I make some extra room over here that won't happen. So we'll see if this works. Okay, so the nervous system, it has three major functions. You're going to find the sensory function, so sending signals about your body and the environment to the brain, where you have integrative function. You'll find you have integrative centers in the brain and some in the spinal cord, specifically for spinal reflexes. And then, of course, motor function, so actions that the body takes. These motor functions are done through effectors. Effectors are things like muscles, so skeletal muscle, but also smooth muscle and cardiac muscle. Those are all effectors. And so are your glands. So like your sweat glands or your endocrine glands. These are effectors. And that belongs to this motor portion. So we can break the nervous system down into two big groups: the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system is going to be made up of your spinal cord and the brain. And then your peripheral nervous system is going to be everything else. So your cranial nerves, your spinal nerves, and everything that is associated with that. So when we talk about the autonomic nervous system, we'll talk about some ganglia that you find outside of the central nervous system. And ganglia is just a collection of neuron bodies or somas. We can break the peripheral nervous system down into two groups. You have your sensory division and your motor division. So the sensory division, sometimes called afferent or afferent division, goes to the central nervous system. So it's taking all that information that is coming in and sending that to the central nervous system. And then your motor division is going to be the opposite of that. This is called the efferent or the efferent division. And so it's going to be sending signals out to effectors, right? So going away from the central nervous system. And then we can break the motor division down into somatic and autonomic. Somatic motor division is going to be the one dealing with your skeletal muscle. So this is all that conscious thought of contracting muscles, right? So moving, singing, walking, talking, like all this requires somatic motor function. The autonomic is going to be everything that is automatic, right? And so this is going to be your cardiac muscle, your smooth muscle, and all your glands belong to this ANS, or autonomic nervous system. And we can break down that one even further. So we can break down the autonomic nervous system into the PANS and the SANS, or the parasympathetic autonomic nervous system. This one is typically dealing with resting and digesting. So it's carrying out normal body homeostasis. Versus your SANS, or the sympathetic autonomic nervous system. This one is dealing with fight and flight, or fight or flight, right? So this is in times of emergency. You get that adrenaline rush. And that comes from the sympathetic autonomic nervous system. So talking about the nervous system, we have to talk about the types of tissue that you find in the nervous system, which is going to be nervous tissue, right? And it's made up of your neurons and your neural glials. Neurons, which we've already covered in the histology section. You know it has three major parts: the dendrites, the receiving side, right? The soma, or the body, and then the axon, so the one that's going to send that signal. And so looking here, you can see your neuron. This would be a motor neuron in the central nervous system. And you see that you have these dendrites out here, the soma, and then the axon, and around it are a bunch of different neuroglial cells. We can break it break these neurons down structurally into 3 different categories. You can have your multipolar neuron, where you have lots of dendrites, the soma, and then the axon. You normally find these multipolar neurons in the central nervous system, so up in the brain and the spinal cord. There are a lot of these types of neurons. We also have our bipolar, where you have your dendrites going to the soma and then away, and it looks pretty even on both sides. With bipolar, you're going to find these in a lot of your special senses, so in the eyes, the nose, and the ears, so dealing with smelling, seeing, and hearing, and equilibrium. You'll have these bipolar cells. And then unipolar, you'll find these in a lot of the ganglia out in the peripheral nervous system. And you can see that the trigger zone for this, instead of being at the axon hillock, it's way down here at the end of the dendrites. And so it just kind of bypasses this soma and acts like just one little signal. So all you have to do is like trigger that, and then it's going to send it. And so we see these again in ganglia out in the peripheral nervous system. So the types of neuroglial cells that we have, you have microglia in the central nervous system. Microglia are going to be carrying out phagocytosis. So your brain has this barrier between the blood vessels or the capillaries in the brain or in the skull. And so these capillaries are really, really tightly held together. If you remember in the glomerulus, we said they were fenestrated, so they had like holes so stuff could get out. These capillaries are continuous. There aren't any gaps in there. And so it's really hard to get stuff across to diffuse into the brain tissue. And so with this blood-brain barrier, you don't get a lot of white blood cells getting across that barrier. You do have some monocytes that can make it in there and turn into microglial, though. Something else we find is oligodendrocytes. Oligodendrocytes carry out myelination. Myelination is a wrapping or an insulation around your nerve fibers. Not all your axons are going to have myelination, but a lot of them in the central nervous system do, especially the larger ones have this myelination or this insulation. And what it does is it helps to speed up conductance. So the speed of that signal is a lot faster when it's myelinated due to like the nodes of Ranvier and stuff that you should get in physiology. And then we have astrocytes. Again, with that blood-brain barrier, it's really hard to get nutrition and waste across back into the blood supply. And so neurons use astrocytes to help facilitate that. And so they can absorb stuff from the capillaries and then give it to the neuron. It also provides structural support for the neuron. And so for one neuron to talk to another, they have to synapse. And they do it at this little gap or synaptic cleft. And the cleft needs to be far enough that you can send the signal, but also close enough so that the diffusion doesn't take too long to stimulate the other cell. And so astrocytes help to hold neurons in the right place so they're not too far and they're not too close to send these signals. And then lastly, in the central nervous system, you're going to find ependymal cells. These cells act like an epithelia. They're nervous tissue, but they act like an epithelia, and they secrete cerebrospinal fluid. And so this is all in the central nervous system. We're only going to talk about one cell that you find outside in the peripheral nervous system. That's going to be your Schwann cells, and they do myelination out there. So if we look at our different types of neuroglia, here you can see an oligodendrocyte reaching out and wrapping around these axons. And they can do multiple wrappings. Oligo means a few, and so an oligodendrocyte has a few dendrites, or these wrapping arms that they use to myelinate. Here you can see a microglial cell. Here's another one. And they'd be carrying out phagocytosis, eating dead cells, eating any particles or pathogens that make it into the nervous tissue. Here's your astrocyte. You can see how it's connected to this capillary and to the neuron to hold it in place and get it nutrients and remove waste for the neuron. Astrocytes do a lot of other stuff too, like salt balance and the reuptake of neurotransmitters to give back to neurons. And then here's your ependymal cells with that cerebral spinal fluid cavity. So that's all in the central nervous system. If you go out into the peripheral, you'll see your Schwann cells here. And an individual Schwann cell can only do one wrapping. And so that cell just wraps. And then here you can see the nucleus of it. And so here would be 1, 2, 3, 4. And so multiple Schwann cells to support one neuron with all that myelination. And here you can see those nodes of Ranvier that help to speed up that signal that comes out. Looking at the Schwann cell a little bit better in this cross section, you can see how it wraps with all this myelin, and then you get your neurolimmal sheath, or the wrapping around the neuron. And we're going to stop there and pick up more specifically with the central nervous system next time.